They thought she was just another quiet black girl with an old violin. But what they didn't know, what they never cared enough to ask, was that she carried an entire world inside that case. And one day she opened it and made the whole room stop breathing. Fifth period, Tuesday. The kind of day where the Ohio sun slants through smudged classroom windows and makes everything feel a little sleepier than it should. In room 213 of Toledo Central Middle School, the desks were arranged in that awkward half circle teachers love, and the air smelled faintly of pencil shavings, gym socks, and whatever cafeteria mystery meat was being served that day. Back row, third seat from the end, by the window. That's where Grace Bennett always sat. Same spot, same silence, same black violin case tucked between her knees like something too fragile to be left on the floor. It was old, scratched, the handle wrapped in black electrical tape, and the edges dulled from years of being carried across city blocks and school hallways. If you asked most kids, they'd say they didn't even know her name. If they noticed her at all, it was probably because of the violin. She never raised her hand, never asked to go to the bathroom, never passed notes, never got caught giggling, never so much as rolled her eyes. She showed up, did her work, and left. To teachers, she was a blessing, quiet, compliant, low maintenance. To other students, she was invisible, which is how she liked it. What they didn't see was what happened after the bell rang. 4 blocks from the school, past the faded mural on Collingwood Boulevard and up 3 flights of crooked, creaky stairs, Grace shared a cramped apartment with her mom and 6-year-old brother Marcus. Apartment 3C always smelled like reheated noodles, cleaning supplies, and occasionally burnt toast. Her mom, Trina Bennett, worked night shifts cleaning office buildings downtown. By the time Grace got home, her mom was prepping dinner with one hand and ironing uniforms with the other. There were no after-school clubs, no mall trips, no group chats blowing up her phone. There was only the violin. The moment she got home, her backpack hit the floor and the case clicked open. No TV, no music, just raw sound, notes that filled the room like breath, sometimes smooth, sometimes sharp, always honest. Grace practiced with a folded towel stuffed under her bedroom door to keep the neighbors from banging on the walls again. She didn't complain. She just played. No sheet music, just memory, muscle, feel. Her violin wasn't fancy. The peg on the E string slipped if she pressed too hard. The bow frayed at the edges like an old shoelace, and the bridge leaned ever so slightly to the left, forcing her to tune the whole thing from scratch at least once a week. But it didn't matter. It was hers, bought secondhand, passed down, worn in, but it sang for her in a way nothing else ever had. No one at school knew that. No one cared to know. They just saw a skinny black girl in hand-me-down hoodies, walking the halls with her head down and a violin case like it was a prop in some quirky indie film. Teachers smiled politely but never asked what she played. Students snickered when she pulled it out during lunch for a quick scale run. Some whispered things, words like weird or trying too hard. Others just ignored her completely. Grace didn't respond. She didn't argue or defend or explain. She just kept walking, eyes ahead, shoulders squared. She had learned a long time ago that being invisible was safer than being misunderstood. But what no one realized, and not the teachers, not the students, not even the assistant principal who passed her in the hall every morning without ever saying her name, was that Grace Bennett had been building something. Something fierce, something beautiful, something that didn't need approval or permission to exist. She was a storm in silence. And the day they dared her to open that violin case and show them what it could do, thinking it would be a joke, a quick laugh before lunch, was the day everything changed. Because Grace wasn't just another quiet girl with a violin. She was the kind of quiet that comes before something powerful, and they were about to hear it. It started like a joke, One of those offhand classroom moments no one thinks twice about, except the person it's aimed at. It was Wednesday, the day after the sign-up sheet for the school talent show went up on the bulletin board near the front office. Most kids ignored it, already assuming the same old routine. A couple singers, a dance crew, maybe someone with a lame card trick. No one was expecting anything new, especially not from Grace. Fifth period rolled around again, and the sun was slanting through the windows just like the day before. Mr. Buckley, the PE teacher turned talent show organizer, stood at the front of the classroom like he had somewhere better to be. He had a clipboard in hand and that same half smirk he always wore when he had to speak to a room full of tired middle schoolers. "All right, folks," he said, clapping his hands once. "Talent shows this Friday." Still got a few slots left. Singers, dancers, magicians, whatever. If you've got a talent, now's your moment. The class barely looked up. Someone in the middle row groaned. Another kid made a fart noise with his hand. Business as usual. Then Miss Dorsey, the math teacher who always acted like she owned the whole building, leaned in from the side of the room and tilted her head toward the back, right toward Grace. "What about our little violinist back there?" she said, loud enough for the entire class to hear. "Been carrying that thing around all year. Let's see what it can actually do." Her voice carried that sugary tone some adults use when they're pretending to be nice but really aren't. The kind that feels more like a slap than a smile. Mr. Buckley chuckled, not thinking twice. "Yeah, come on, Bennett," he said, grinning. "Show us what that thing can do. You've been hiding it long enough. Might as well make it worth the wait." That's when the laughter started. Not explosive, not mean at first, just the low, creeping kind that spreads like spilled soda on a lunch table. Sticky, fast, and hard to clean up. Someone in the second row whispered something about cat screeches. Another kid made an exaggerated, high-pitched squeal, mimicking the sound of a violin being butchered. It snowballed from there. Snickers, side eyes, and one or two mock claps. Miss Dorsey smiled like she just handed Grace a compliment. "Just teasing, sweetheart," she added, brushing off the moment with a wink. Grace didn't look up, not right away. Her fingers tightened around the neck of her violin case. Her shoulders didn't move, didn't shake. But inside, her whole body was burning. She'd felt this kind of attention before. The kind meant to shrink you down until you barely existed. And then, clear as a bell, came her voice. "I'll do it," she said. The words weren't loud. They weren't angry. They didn't even carry weight. But they stopped the room cold. Mr. Buckley blinked. "You serious?" Grace didn't say it again. She didn't have to. She slid the case off her lap, set it on the desk in front of her, and reached for the clipboard, making its way around the class. No drama, no eye contact, just her name, Grace Bennett, on the line, written in neat, steady handwriting. Miss Dorsey blinked, her smirk faltering just slightly. "Well," she said with a nervous little chuckle, "that's the spirit, I guess." But behind that teacher voice, behind the carefully constructed, pleasant expression, was something else entirely. Doubt. Maybe even fear. Because no one had expected Grace to say yes. Least of all the people who only ever looked at her when they were looking down. After class, the whispers followed her down the hallway like gnats. A few kids smirked. Some laughed behind cupped hands. One even made a fake violin motion as she walked past. Grace didn't respond. She never did. But as she turned the corner toward the back stairwell, her grip on the violin case tightened, her jaw locked. By the time she reached home, apartment 3C, third floor, back of the building, the air was thick with the smell of reheated spaghetti and bleach. The kitchen light buzzed overhead, and her little brother Marcus sat cross-legged on the floor in a superhero t-shirt, watching cartoons with the volume turned low. "You eat anything yet?" her mom called from the kitchen, still in her work uniform, wiping down the counter. Not hungry, Grace said, dropping her backpack with a dull thud by the door. You better eat, her mom warned, not unkindly. Don't make me come in there. Grace smiled just a little. Her mom always said that, but she never did come in. Not when Grace was about to practice. In her bedroom, the walls were thin, the paint cracked near the window, and a faint water stain spread like a cloud near the ceiling. Her mattress sat low on the floor beside a small desk, its surface covered in rosin dust and scribbled music notes. No computer, no headphones, no distractions. She sat cross-legged on the worn carpet, placed the violin gently in her lap, and opened the case. It was a ritual, sacred. The bow had frayed edges that tickled her fingers. The E string buzzed if she didn't press just right. The bridge leaned a little more to the left than it should have. Every few days, she had to retune the whole instrument from scratch. But Grace didn't complain. This violin wasn't just an instrument. It was her voice. She didn't remember a time before it. Her grandfather, who passed when she was 9, had been the one to teach her the basics. He played blues on an old fiddle that had more scratches than varnish. He used to say, "When you can't speak the truth, let the music tell it for you." So she did. Every day after school, while kids went to soccer practice or FaceTime their friends, Grace played until her fingertips burned. Her mom would press her ear to the wall in the kitchen and listen quietly. That was their system. No knocking, no interruptions, unless Grace hit a bad note. Then came 3 soft taps on the wall. Tap, tap, tap. Start over. Not out of disappointment, not punishment, just a reminder. Do it again, baby. Do it right. It was never about being perfect. It was about being honest. Most nights she played for hours. No sheet music, no YouTube tutorials. Everything was stored in muscle memory, heart memory, notes that twisted and stretched and bled through the strings, carrying feelings she didn't know how to say out loud. When she played, her hands stopped shaking. The noise of the day faded. The laughter, the stares, the smirks, gone. Out in the living room, Marcus would sometimes crawl to her doorway and sit quietly, hugging a stuffed bear. He never said much, just watched. One night, he asked, "You gonna win the show?" Grace shrugged, eyes still closed, bow gliding across the strings. "I don't know." "Why don't you play happy songs?" he asked. She paused. "I do," she said. "They sound like crying sometimes." Grace looked at him. "Sometimes happy and sad sound the same." He nodded like he understood, even if he didn't. In that tiny apartment, under the hum of flickering lights and the soft clink of dishes in the sink, Grace kept building something. Not just a performance, not even a statement, a truth. And when she played it on stage, they wouldn't just hear her. They'd finally see her. By Thursday, the list of performers was taped to the glass outside the main office, right next to the broken vending machine that hadn't worked in years. Kids crowded around it between classes, their fingers dragging down the paper, searching for familiar names. There were the usual suspects: Derek Simmons doing stand-up, Ashley and her dance crew, Malik on piano. Then about halfway down the list sat a name most didn't recognize. 16, Grace Bennett. Some kids squinted like it had to be a mistake. "Who's that?" someone muttered, chewing on the end of a pencil. "That's the violin girl," another replied. "She's in my math class. Never talks. Probably gonna play Mary Had a Little Lamb and cry." Laughter again. But this time Grace didn't flinch. She walked right past them, her sneakers quiet on the tile, her case in one hand like it weighed nothing. On the outside, she was the same girl she'd always been. Head down, hoodie sleeves tugged over her wrists, backpack slung low. But inside, something was moving. In the cafeteria, Mr. Buckley shouted across the basketball court while pretending to care who signed up. "Show's tomorrow, people. No backing out now." He spotted Grace sitting alone at the edge of the lunch yard, her violin on her lap. quietly tuning the strings by ear. "You ready, Bennett?" he called with a grin, like he was still in on the joke. Grace looked up, not with anger, not even with annoyance, just a blank, unreadable stare. She didn't answer, didn't need to. Inside the teacher's lounge, Miss Dorsey sipped coffee with one hand and flipped through the talent show lineup with the other. When she saw Grace's name again, she rolled her eyes. Seriously? Who let her sign up? She did, said Mrs. Tran, the art teacher, without looking up from her crossword. She's got the same right as anyone else. Miss Dorsey scoffed. It's not about rights, it's about awareness. She's setting herself up. Mrs. Tran raised an eyebrow. Maybe she surprises you. Dorsey didn't reply, but the tightness in her jaw said plenty. That night, back in apartment 3C, Grace sat on the edge of her mattress with her violin and a blank notebook. Her mom leaned against the doorframe, drying her hands on a dish towel. You sure about this? Trina asked, stepping into the room. Grace nodded, eyes still on the strings. I already said yes. Her mom walked over, sat beside her, and picked up the bow. Worn, frayed, familiar. You don't have to prove anything to people who don't even see you. Grace didn't look up. I'm not doing it for them. Trina tilted her head. Then who? Grace was quiet for a moment. Her eyes drifted to the water stain on the ceiling, the same one she used to stare at when she was little. I guess, me. Her mom smiled and pulled her close. Then do it right. The next day, the whispers got louder. Some said she'd chicken out. Others bet she'd freeze on stage. A few started to wonder, what if she could actually play? But even they said it with a smirk. Only Malik, the quiet seventh grader who played piano after school, walked up to her by the library lockers. You doing something original or a cover? He asked, hands in his pockets. Grace blinked. Original? He smiled. Good. Do something they can't compare to nothing else. She didn't smile back, but she nodded, and that was enough, because she hadn't been practicing for applause. She'd been preparing for the moment they couldn't look away. Friday came fast. The gym smelled like floor polish and anticipation, scuffed wood, folding chairs, too many bodies packed into too little space. No parents yet, just students and staff, buzzing with the usual pre-show energy, half curiosity, half bloodlust. Everyone was waiting for someone to mess up. Phones were already out, cameras primed to catch embarrassment. Laughter was ready to be weaponized. Backstage, Grace sat on a metal chair, her violin across her knees, fingers tapping out rhythms like Morse code. Her palms were damp, her stomach twisted into knots. But she wasn't afraid. Not exactly. She'd played this piece 100 times, maybe more. It didn't have a name. It didn't need one. It started with a single note, stretched thin and quiet like it was trying to slip beneath a door. Then came the shift, the turn, the moment that made people sit up straight. Her grandfather once told her, make them feel like they've been dragged through something real, then give them peace. That's what she'd built, a storm with a soft landing. 16, someone whispered near the curtain. She's number 16. The whisper didn't sound cruel this time, just surprise. The show moved fast. A few singers, a dance crew, a kid with knock-knock jokes that fell flat. Some acts got polite claps, others were background noise for scrolling thumbs. Then the MC's voice crackled through the old speaker system. Next up, Grace Bennett? There was a pause, a cough. Someone shuffled in their seat. The clap that followed was sparse, uncertain. Backstage, Grace stood up like someone had pulled a string through her spine. She didn't look at the audience, didn't glance at the teachers. She just walked, one step at a time, onto the stage, her violin in one hand, her bow in the other. Kids in the front row elbowed each other. Phones rose. She stopped at center stage. A single spotlight buzzed overhead, casting her shadow long against the curtain. Someone had dragged out a folding chair for her, but she didn't sit. She didn't speak. She didn't smile. She raised the violin to her shoulder and waited. The silence stretched. Mr. Buckley shifted near the stage door. Miss Dorsey leaned forward in her seat like she was waiting for a punchline. Someone in the crowd whispered, "She's gonna choke." But then she played. The first note trembled, thin, hesitant, like it wasn't sure it belonged. But she held it. Let it bloom. By the fifth note, the room was frozen. Not a shuffle, not a cough, just stillness. Because this wasn't Mary Had a Little Lamb. It wasn't some TikTok cover or school band classic. It was something raw, something no one could place. Her bow moved like a dancer with something to prove. Her fingers flew, bending notes that sounded like grief, like anger, like a voice finally raised after being silenced for too long. Halfway through, the piece shifted. It surged. It wept. It fought back. Her eyes were closed, not from fear but focus. She didn't need sight. Everything she wanted to say was in her hands, in the strings, in the air now thick with sound and truth. When she hit the high note, she held it so long the gym felt like it was holding its breath. Even Buckley, who'd been scrolling on his phone before, was still. Teachers leaned forward, uncertain, maybe even ashamed. The final note didn't fade. It lingered, hung like a question or a wound. And when it ended, Grace didn't move. She stood still, bowed down, violin pressed against her chest like it was part of her. No one laughed, no one breathed. Then one clap. From the back, then another, and another. Then the whole gym erupted, not wild, not screaming, just full, real. Some students looked at their phones, suddenly ashamed they'd recorded her, expecting failure. Malik was the first to stand. Then more followed. Even the kids who'd bet she'd freeze. Grace didn't smile, didn't cry. She didn't have to. She just turned and walked off stage, holding her violin like it had done exactly what it came to do. Monday morning brought gray skies and the smell of wet concrete, the kind of weather that usually made students move slower, slouch deeper into their hoodies and avoid eye contact. But not today. Not for Grace. The moment she stepped through the double doors of Toledo Central, she felt it. Something had shifted. Students who once brushed past her without a glance now made space in the hallway. A few nodded, awkward but respectful. Others looked like they wanted to say something but didn't know how. By the lockers, a girl she didn't even know whispered, "That's her." Like Grace was someone you only ever heard about, not someone you passed in homeroom every day. It wasn't fame. It was something deeper. Recognition. Respect. For the first time, she wasn't invisible. She walked the same route to her locker, violin case in hand, hoodie sleeves tugged over her wrists like always. But this time, no one mocked her. No one rolled their eyes. No one made fake screeching sounds when she passed. Even the posters on the walls felt different, like they were finally hanging in a school where she belonged. Near the stairwell, Mr. Buckley leaned against the railing, phone in hand. When he spotted Grace, he straightened up like he'd just remembered she existed. "Hey, amazing job Friday," he said, flashing an awkward smile. Grace nodded once, not slowing down. She wasn't rude. She just didn't know him anything. She passed the main office, then rounded the corner to room 213, fifth period math. Miss Dorsey stood at the doorway, arms crossed, a stack of worksheets in hand. Her expression was unreadable. For a moment, she didn't say anything. She just looked at Grace, like she was trying to find the version of the girl she used to ignore, the version that fit neatly into her assumptions. "Miss Bennett," she said carefully, "can I have a word?" Grace paused but didn't move closer. Miss Dorsey cleared her throat. I owe you an apology. What I said last week wasn't right. There was a long pause. I shouldn't have made assumptions, she added. I'm still learning. Grace stared at her, quiet, not cold, just deliberate. There were so many things she could have said, sharp things, honest things. But instead, she let the silence stretch, just long enough to make it count. Then she said, You should have seen me before Friday. That landed harder than anything else could have. Miss Dorsey blinked, unsure of what to say. Grace didn't wait. She walked into the classroom, set her case down by her desk, and sat. Same seat, same silence. But nothing was the same anymore. At lunch, Malik slid into the seat across from her and handed over a carton of chocolate milk. No big words, no compliments, just a nod. Next time we play a duet, he said. Grace raised an eyebrow. You're not ready. He grinned, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself laugh, just a little, just enough to turn a few heads. That evening, back in apartment 3C, she didn't reach for her violin right away. Instead, she sat on the couch next to Marcus, watching cartoons with the sound off. The quiet felt earned, like the kind that only comes after you've said everything you needed to say. From the kitchen, her mom peeked out. You not practicing? Not tonight, Grace said, still watching the screen. You good? Grace thought for a second, then nodded. Yeah, I'm good. Not everyone who clapped had truly seen her. Not everyone who stood that day would change overnight, but some did, and sometimes that's enough to start something. What happened to Grace wasn't loud. It wasn't some slur screamed across the hallway or a textbook case of hate. No, it was quieter than that. Smarter, more acceptable. It wore a smile. It came in the form of just teasing, in side eyes and assumptions wrapped in politeness. Because racism doesn't always shout. Sometimes it smirks. Like when Miss Dorsey singled her out, pretending it was encouragement when everyone in the room knew it wasn't. When she called her sweetheart and laughed as if Grace didn't understand what was really being said. As if Grace's silence meant she couldn't feel. Like when Mr. Buckley joked about making it worth the wait without realizing, or maybe without caring, that he was dismissing months, years of practice with one offhand comment. The way they all treated her violin like a novelty, not a skill, like a joke, not a voice. They didn't expect anything from her, not because she wasn't capable, but because she didn't fit the mold they'd quietly agreed on. White, loud, polished, palatable. Grace wasn't any of that. She was a quiet black girl who didn't smile at the right time, didn't crack jokes in class, didn't seek approval. And for people like Miss Dorsey, that was uncomfortable. Not defiant enough to punish, not friendly enough to praise. Just there. Easy to overlook, easier to mock. That's how it works sometimes. You don't get told you don't belong. You get reminded subtly every day that no one expects you to shine. And when you do, they act surprised, like your brilliance is a fluke, like your performance is some rare exception to the rule they never admitted existed. The day after the show, Grace overheard two teachers in the copy room. I didn't know she could play like that, one said. Maybe she just got lucky, the other replied, as if talent didn't count unless it came from the right kind of student, as if her years of work, of sweat, of silence were just coincidence. Even now in the hallway, Grace could feel it. The stares were different, but not all were kind. Some were calculating, some skeptical, as if they were still trying to place her, as if they weren't sure what to do now that she'd broken the version of her they had in their heads. But Grace didn't shrink. She knew what it was. She had seen it her whole life, and she wasn't playing their game. Because the truth is, she never wanted a seat at their table. She brought her own chair, Some people clapped for Grace because they were genuinely moved. Some clapped because they didn't know what else to do. And some stood not because they respected her, but because it suddenly felt like the right thing. Like maybe they'd missed something and didn't want to be the last to catch on. But that didn't matter, because Grace hadn't played for applause. She hadn't stood on that stage to prove something to them. She did it for herself, for every time she was ignored, for every time someone looked past her like she wasn't worth the air she breathed, for every offhand joke, every smirk, every whisper that chipped away at her presence without ever daring to say her name out loud. She didn't just play music, she told the truth. With every bow stroke, she claimed space that had been denied to her. With every note, she carved out visibility in a system designed to keep girls like her small, quiet, and grateful just to be allowed in the room. And when it was done, when the gym had fallen into that stunned, reverent silence, Grace didn't need a standing ovation to know she mattered. She felt it in her bones. Back home, as she sat beside Marcus on the couch, cartoons flickering across the muted screen, the violin rested nearby, unplayed, just for the night. Her mom peeked in from the kitchen. "You good?" Grace didn't hesitate. "Yeah," she said softly. "I'm good. Not everyone will understand you. Not everyone will listen the first time. And some people will only ever hear you when you make it impossible for them not to. But speak anyway. Play anyway. Tell your truth even if your voice shakes, even if your hands tremble, even if the world around you would rather you stay silent. Because somewhere, someone needs to hear it. And maybe, just maybe, they'll finally start listening.